It's my pleasure to introduce my friend Greg Hoover. We have been talking about having Greg for several years, and we finally got to a point where Greg and I were talking about some insect borer I had on my tree, and I asked him how to get rid of it, and he said, "Here's what you're going to do." So I did that, and we fingers crossed, Greg, that it goes away.
Good.
Greg is known for his knowledge of fly fishing entomology. Greg received his master's degree based on his thesis research on Penn Creek's famous green drake hatch. I'm sure there was like fish a little bit, wait for the drakes to happen, and then do a little bit of work, and then fish till it's dark. He taught entomology 425 freshwater entomology as an undergraduate and graduate level course in the Department of Entomology at Penn State. Greg also knows terrestrials too. I know Greg because he is known for his work on woody ornamentals and trees, especially those trees that have borers that bore into them, the boring insects. They're not boring, they're exciting, but they do bore a hole. He taught entomology for 28 years at Penn State, where for 21 of those years, Greg enjoyed the role of being faculty advisor for the Penn State Fly Fishing Club, which at any given time had 100 student members. Greg is the recipient of the George Harvey Award for unselfishly promoting the sport of fly fishing through teaching others. Greg is the 2012 Order of the Hat award recipient from the Fly Fishers Club of Harrisonburg as honor given to an individual contributing to the conservation of natural resources in fly rod angling. When I first read this, the Order of the Hat, I just thought about the Red Hat Club. I've been at places where the red hats come in. It's quite exciting. For 8 years, Greg has been lead instructor and taught the courses Principles of Fly Fishing, Fly Tying and Fly Fishing for Trout, and the Mastery of Fly Fishing at Penn State, continuing the tradition started by the late George Harvey in 1934. Greg co-authored a book with Charlie Meck, Great Rivers, Great Hatches, and I'm almost positive that the Deerfield River is in that book. That book is 384 pages. It covers 60 high-quality trout streams and their hatches. I have a copy of that book, and sometimes when I get together with Greg, I'm going to ask him to sign it and make it a collector's edition. Greg contributed to a chapter on the periodic cicadic in the book Modern Terrestrials. He's also written articles on trout stream insects and fly fishing that were published in Outdoor Life, Fly Tire, American Angler, and Mid-Atlantic Fly Fishing Guide. So please help me welcome my dear friend, Greg Hoover. He's gonna tell you about all the things. When he told me about what he's gonna talk about, I'm like, oh, this is awesome. All the things that I paraphrased, and I said, all the things that people don't know about insects on the river. And he's gonna dispel some of those myths of the things that you hear. So thank you, Greg, for joining us, and take it away, buddy.
Okay, thank you very much, Randy. And I've told Randy in an email reply, I was really looking forward to this presentation, but I have to admit that I am amazed at what the Deerfield River Watershed TU chapter is doing and has accomplished. If you folks aren't worthy for the Golden Trout Award, I don't know what chapter in the United States is more worthy. Your list, Eric, of what your membership's involved with is truly impressive. And my time is spent with the Spring Creek chapter of Trout Unlimited. And when you have Penn State as a resource, they're able to do a lot of things. But what you folks are doing in the Deerfield River Watershed is truly amazing. And give yourself a standing ovation for what you've accomplished. It is truly remarkable. Well, I, this title is one I always struggle with, and hopefully I'm seeing that it's cut off. Are you seeing the entire slide as I'm seeing it in PowerPoint, or is there the thumbnails covering over the right-hand side of the image?
No, I'm seeing the whole thing.
Beautiful.
I-
Okay, good. That's the last time I asked that question. What I'm frustrated with is, and as Randy, shared, being a professional, bug geek all my life, it's not easy for me on Mondays and Fridays. I do work at Fly Fisher's Paradise, and it allows me to keep my educator hat on, because as any of you have been in fly shops, the skill set is as varied as our fly fishing population as it relates to knowledge and insights and all the things we call fly fishing and fly tying. And so my goal with this presentation tonight is to try to dispel some misinformation, and maybe have you realize a lot more bends in the tip of your fly rod, and maybe better appreciate some of the things that are truly important sources of food for the fish we pursue. And so that's where we're headed. I don't want to come across as, everybody needs to know this, but it's some points of frustration that I think are important when you're fishing, or whether you're tying flies. And I've tied flies for, it's close to 60 years. And it's something that my wife of almost 50 years will say to me if I say something stupid or do something stupid. She says, you need to go fly fishing, or why don't you go tie some flies? And guess what? I never argue with her. So we mentioned Penn State, and thanks to Randy for the university support sweatshirt, and Eric with your being an alum of Penn State. This is a shot of George Harvey when he was still with us, and this is his fly tying room at his house in State College. And I have a lot to thank George with regard to how he taught me the fine details of how to tie a durable as well as effective fly. He literally, with getting eggs, allowed buck Mets to develop the Mets flock that many of us have had access to in the way of fly tying materials. But George was a taskmaster. When I sat in the chair he's seated in, and I tied a fly in my eyes that looked pretty good, I got real nervous when I saw the single edge razor blade come out, and he would shave the hook and say, Greg, you can do better than that. And so that's how I learned how to tie flies by and from George Harvey. He wanted, detail, and that's what made him the originator of the fly fishing courses that Penn State is known for. And in fact, as best as we can tell, thanks to George, it was the first university in the country to start credited courses in the art of fly tying and fly fishing for trout. And I just happened, when an individual was retiring, this is a room in Rec Hall where Penn State wrestling and volleyball takes place. This is just one section of 25 students. That day, we were tying the rolled winged light Cahill dry fly, and you can see the intensity on the students, and it truly is something that I will miss to my dying day, because of the enthusiasm that the students had when they took this 15-week course. And as you can see, there were 2 flat screen monitors and a video camera that allowed them to see what I was doing. And again, I would have 4 sections of 25 students in each section in the beginning course. And then in the mastery course, I would have 15 students that it seemed like the 2 3/4 hour period went by in about 15 minutes with the passion that they had. So I always say it this way, whether Joe Pa, Bill O'Brien, James Franklin was standing at the door, I would announce, we were fly fishing you before we became linebacker you. And so, tonight we're going to look at some inhabitants of larger rivers, such as the Yaak or the Allegheny River in southwestern Pennsylvania, or I don't know how many mill creeks there are or mill brooks in Massachusetts, but we've got plenty of mill creeks in Pennsylvania. This happens to be one in Sullivan County that's got both wild brook and wild brown trout. And then I'm sure
Up here,
Go
I
ahead.
just want, everything is called a river. So it's Mill River, Mill River, Mill River, all over the
Okay.
place. And
Okay.
we call them a creek. Being from Pennsylvania, call them a creek or a crick.
There you go. Yeah, crick is the pronunciation in the rural areas of Pennsylvania. But this is one that Vince Marinaro and Charlie Fox made famous through their research on spawning brown trout and fishing the sulfur and trico hatches. Here's a test, and I know most everybody's on mute, but it's the teacher in me. I apologize. Can you find the sculpin in this image from Fishing Creek in Clinton County? And I'll be frank with you folks, I didn't see this when I broke out my Olympus Stylus Tough camera. I was actually taking pictures of some black-nosed dace. But if you look closely, I can just show you the head of that sculpin. And again, what does a muddler minnow imitate? We've got sculpin imitations. Obviously, it's not an insect, but look how well it's hidden from those large brown trout that exist in that stream. Here's another question. This every time I look at this, it looks like this mayfly was going 80 miles an hour and slammed into a wall. It just looks so robust, and the wing height seems abnormally large for this specimen that we would imitate on a size 14 dry fly. And maybe now you can see, wow, now I know why an Adams is an excellent imitation. This happens to be one of a group of unusual mayflies that in a couple creeks in northwestern Pennsylvania, we have fishable emergences where on the right you see the nymph which crawls out on to emergent substrate, just like slake drakes do in most cases. And that's where the duns will emerge. And again, it's a group of mayflies, not real species rich, but again, north central and northwestern PA, usually the end of May. This is a photo that brings back lots of memories. And this is, if any of you have ever been on Spruce Creek, west of State College, I'm standing next to a gentleman whose name you, I'm sure, will remember as Lefty Cray. And we're there to teach a school. And this is early one morning on a covered bridge over top of Spruce Creek on the Wayne Harpster property. And I'm sure most of you know that shore isn't a trico rise form. And with that overhead cover, I'm sure a carpenter ant probably met its demise with regard to that rise form. Randy mentioned I should challenge you as it relates to fly pattern knowledge. And so this is the first question, and fly pattern obviously in quotes. Anybody want to come up with the name? And I'm sure many of you nailed it, but that's what some people call a blue-winged olive. Now, that's deer hair for the body, and a blue dyed hen hackle for the wings. Somebody knows how to spin and stack and trim deer hair. I'll show the tire here in a second. I'll give you a hint. This is a really effective pattern out west. You're right. It's a copper john. So
I got that one.
yeah, there you go. Again, the person, and I think this is something in the world of fly fishing and fly tying, we often forget who showed us that secret pattern that we go to, or showed us a technique in building a leader that allows us to turn over our presentations. But Dave Schmezer, who used to hail from southwestern Pennsylvania, is who tied those flies. He has a few others. If you've ever been to some fly tying shows, you may have personally witnessed him. Dave is now, I think the last I've known, is in Florida. So, topic is insects. Why should fly rod anglers look at insects in, on, or along a trout stream? This is a quote that I took from someone I know you all will recognize. And basically, a lot of people aren't too interested in insects. It's just us bug geeks, if you want to call us that really get into it, and maybe we can justify it professionally. But a lot of times, if people don't look at them, they often will just catch a few fish. And that's the late Ernie Schwiebert who stated that comment. So another question, and this is one that I've seen when people are doing macroinvertebrate work, and they'll call both of these hellgrammites, when in fact they're not. One, either A or B, is a hellgrammite, and the other is a fish fly larva. And I'll point out that the hellgrammite has gills at the base of those lateral projections, whereas in A, the fish fly larva lacks those gills. Now, should you incorporate gills on your woolly buggers? I think that's a little overkill. I don't think that's necessary. But what you may want to do, so black and olive woolly buggers work very effective. Maybe when you're fishing headwater streams, consider imitating fish fly larvae with grayish brown or tan woolly buggers that are maybe about a half to two-thirds the size of the immature stage of a Dobson fly, what we call a hellgrammite. The late Russ Blessing was the originator of the woolly bugger, and he hailed from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So let's look at my favorite group. You might have thought, since Randy was talking about wood-boring insects, that's Hoover's interest, and it's really not. I think mayflies are the neatest insects on planet Earth. Several years ago, research that I got funded allowed me over the course of 4 years to put 14,000 miles on my personal vehicle. And after collecting over 17,000 specimens, I arrived at the fact that we have more than 200 different species of mayflies in Pennsylvania. And they are a primary basis for our sport. We imitate different species and their life stages for most of the flies we tie. And in North America, there's over 150 species that commonly occur on trout water that have been used for fashioning fly patterns. Mayflies are the only group of insects on planet Earth that molt one additional time once they're winged. No other insects on planet Earth do that. You as fly fishers know that. A lot of other folks do not. So this is what mayfly people call a subimago. That just means subadult, and you know it as a dun in the fly fishing world. And this is the same specimen, folks, 24 hours later, after it molted It is a male spinner, and we use imago to describe a true adult mayfly, but in the fly fishing world, we call them spinners. This is something I get asked questions about, and on windy days, people will see these being blown out of the crowns of trees and landing on the water. And a couple people have even shared the fact they've seen trout eating them. And I haven't personally witnessed that, but what you're looking at is the cast exoskeleton of the dun of a mayfly. It's called a pellicle. And I know all of you got up this morning and that's what you wanted to find out. I'm tongue in cheek there. But again, that's something that you'll see on foliage, and that might help you diagnose what might be the first best fly to pull out of your fly box. I would propose to you, and I hear this often misused, whether it's at the parking lot after fishing or in fly shops, and that is, what is a hatch? And I would propose that it's a word used to describe when immature stages of aquatic insects, such as a mayfly, will molt and then become winged. Think about the patterns that we use that are effective during a hatch. And here I was very fortunate to capture a golden drake dun emerging from its nymphal exoskeleton. That's what I would propose we use as a definition of a hatch. And then swarm is when the adult or winged life stages, whether it be caddisflies, whether it be mayflies, are mating, and then the females are laying eggs in the surface or attached to submerged substrate. This happens to be several species of mayflies. It's not a fog over the Juniata River in south central Pennsylvania. Literally, the road looked like it had glass. There were that many spinners on the road, as well as depicted here in the air. So that's a swarm. And again, thanks to Gary Larson and other humorous cartoonists, I think we all get it that mayflies are only on the wing, in some cases, just for a few hours, like the whitefly, or in most cases, just a short period of time before they die. Here's my next, our first application of information. That is, what's the difference between a little blue-winged olive dun and a blue-winged olive dun? I hear, right now in fly shops, people are saying, hey, I saw some blue-winged olives emerging. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't really tell you, is it a size 14 or is it a size 18 or 20? And so the little blue-winged olives are members of the family Betidae, and this particular species, Betis tricaudatus, is the little blue-winged olive dun. For those of you that go all over the United States fly fishing, this species is distributed across the country. Those of you that have been at fly tying and fly fishing for a long period of time may recall in the older literature, this was Betis or Batis vagans. What taxonomists have done, they went back and looked at what this species was first described as, and they honor that taxonomist's description, thus the change. And again, tricaudatus, it's got 3 tails. And so we'd imitate this on either a size 18 or size 20. They've been emerging on Spring Creek in the State College area here in Pennsylvania for about 2 weeks. And the fish, the brown trout, are eating them on the surface. And folks are having good days with emergers with size 18 pheasant tails, as well as little blue-winged olive nymphs. And there is a shot of a mature little blue-winged olive dun nymph. And for those of you that are fly tyers, first thing I'd like to suggest is look at the proportions of this particular life stage. look at and what may be apparent till I'm complete here with this presentation. Look at the black wing pads. For those of you that have been tying with dark quill or with thin skin, excellent choice in using black. Those life stages are mature, therefore are active and thus vulnerable to being fed on by trout. If you wanted to fish a size 18 parachute little blue-winged olive, done, and then maybe hang off the bend of that hook a thin little blue-winged olive nymph imitation, excellent go-to, tandem rig. And again, the top side of this nymph is fairly dark. The underside is a light olive. They emerge in the surface film. So again, sparkle duns, compara duns would be very effective. Again, in size 18s and size 20s. This species has 2 generations a year. You will see one now, and usually by the middle of April, the first brood or generation is complete. But then in the fall, starting usually and sometime in September, and I've seen them on our streams in central Pennsylvania into early November. Just imitate them on one size smaller. Go to a size 20 and you'll have some memorable days on the water. Here's a wild brown trout feeding. And again, you can see how it's lined up in the bubble line. You can see a little blue-winged olive up here coming right into its feeding lane. So again, your powers of observation will pay off. One of the things several years ago, this undergrad student got a fellowship from Spring Creek TU, and he's repeating the DEP sampling stations. And I show you this because this was in March. And if you were looking in the air, you wouldn't have seen what was happening. Sorry, it's the teacher in me. This is a shot I took, and I'm standing in the creek, and I didn't see all of these until I started looking at the finished image. But I'll just show you, there's a half a dozen little blue-winged olives within about a 10-inch linear area right next to the water's edge. And this is this first generation. It would be suicide for them to fly up into the crowns of the trees where there's a dramatic change in air temperature. So with the stability of the water temperature, this happens to be Yellow Creek south of Altoona, you can see the number of duns that are taking advantage of the water's edge. And again, little blue-winged olive duns. This is the male. It's about a size smaller than the female. When a hatch starts, it's usually mostly comprised of male mayflies. And then as the emergence goes, there are more and more females as that hatch takes place. Again, for those of you that are fly tyers, I hope you're taking a look at the underside of the abdomen, not the top side, to select what color dubbing might work best. And this is a female. One of the things that I'd like to point out, and hopefully you can see it, the back edge of the front wing looks like it's got dirt or dust hanging on it. That is part of that shed exoskeleton. And mayflies are very unique in that their entire bodies are covered with these tiny hairs we call microtrichae. And that's what allows them to escape the surface tension of water and fly off into riparian vegetation and elsewhere. That's common when they molt. They lose quite a bit of weight, and those tiny hairs are shed with the dun's exoskeleton. And so that's the tip of my finger. That's a little blue-winged olive dun, and I'll question whether or not that's a dun or a spinner. kind of tough to see. And again, sorry for the challenges, but I had let the cat out of the bag. Even though it looks like it's got clear wings, its appendages aren't elongate. So that's actually one of the male second generation, obviously much smaller than those that are hatching right now. So again, when we're communicating, hopefully little gets inserted and not blue-winged olive duns. And here's my reason for that. We can imitate them with cut wings, meaning this species. Or here's one of my favorite patterns, and apologies to the hackle growers. I'll use this pattern from size 14 to size 22. And basically the wing and the tail or the trailing shuck is antron yarn. And you make a loop out of that antron yarn and tie it down in that position, 1/3 back from the hook eye or 2/3 forward. You then build a thread dam in front of that loop so the wing stays upright. And then you dub whatever color body. You could use this for a wide range of mayflies. And then you cut through the loop. And what you're left with, it looks like a turkey gobbler strutting. Those fibers fan out, put a little drop of head cement at the base of those fibers, and this floats in the surface film, and it's a great pattern for little blue-winged olive hatching. So that's little blue-winged olive. Look at this particular species that, again, some people are saying blue-winged olive right now, which is a misnomer to the mayfly guy. It's in a different family. It's in the same family as Hendricksons and red quills and sulfurs, chocolate duns. This is probably the more common species. It's distributed in the Midwest and in the East. And there are other species in the genus Drunella. Some people even use cornutas to describe this group. And we would imitate these on larger hooks. So again, that's what we need to know. Let's look at the difference between these two. Look at how robust the blue-winged olive is. And look at what I mentioned to you about black wing pads. I think that may be a sign of a good meal for those of you that tie your own flies. Look at, I tell students and others, this thing looks like it was hanging out in the weight room. Its front legs look like, they've been pumped up by lifting weights. And this particular life stage, we would imitate with an olive pheasant tail or an olive, like a 3906B mustad or some other heavy, short wired hook to imitate the mature nymph of the blue-winged olive. These individuals will start hatching in late May, and I've seen them and other species in the genus will hatch into mid-July. So it's over a long period of time. It's an important species. What I love about it, the duns will emerge in late morning and sporadically through the afternoon. And I'll get to the spinner seasonality here in a second. There's a blue-winged olive dun, the male, and you can see with mayflies, the males have big compound eyes. I think this might be a sign of a good meal. Only on half of those individuals, but you fully know if you're a fly tyer, we put egg sacs on the backs of our imitations. Why wouldn't we think about putting, some red dubbing on the front of half of a population? This holds true for those of you who are familiar with red quills. Their compound eyes are red. I think that might be something important to imitate. Look at how dark olive this particular specimen is. Tremendous variation. In fact, when you observe the color of a freshly hatched mayfly coming off, let's say the Deerfield, look at the underside of the abdomen. When they're at rest in the riparian vegetation, they'll darken up. So if you want to imitate what the trout's seeing, try to observe the color of the dun when it first emerges off the surface of the water. I gave this presentation several years ago to a TU group in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I shared the image with the red eyes. A couple weeks later, one of their excellent fly tyers sent me the pattern on the right, and he actually used plastic beads, and he said he believes as well that that's something worthwhile imitating at the vise. So again, food for thought. One of the other things about this pattern, if you notice, what he did was twisted some synthetic material to give the illusion of segmentation. Again, I think he divided a strip of Antron yarn by about a third and then twisted it to bring about that segmented look. So there is a blue-winged olive spinner, and look at how dark they are. I've been in parking lots and elsewhere where beginners to our sport are saying, man, did I catch a couple fish tonight on, in their words, a black gannet. And again, this is a very dark mayfly, not just the males, and the spinners fall usually maybe a half hour, 45 minutes before dusk, and you'll see them fall into the first hour, or not even an hour, first half hour of nightfall. It is, sorry, Randy, this is my favorite hatch. You don't need elbow pads, as some people have started to say. You don't need breath mints for how close other anglers are to you. It's an important species on a lot of our streams here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere throughout the Midwest. This is a female blue-winged olive dun. You can see obviously with the sac of eggs at the tip of her abdomen. Very difficult to see when they've fallen on the water, but again, a size 14 or a size 16, very dark olive. You may use biots for the body, or you just may use dubbing, whether you use poly. I've in recent years have come to use organza for spinner wings. If you haven't tried that, a little bit of sparkle, and I think it gets the attention of our quarry. So another one. I once asked this question of George Harvey, and he stopped, and I thought, you know, he was in his late 80s at the time, and he paused and paused, and I thought, okay, here comes the you know, dissertation on what it is. And his reply to me was, Greg, I have no idea where sulfur came from. He said, what I grew up with, and I think I looked at Mike Cole's publication on Massachusetts aquatic insects. And in there, and I kind of smiled, sort of the old term that I grew up with was pale evening duns for what we now call sulfurs. But I got a question. I have seen specimens brought into fly shops. I've been asked to look at them along the stream with these words. Boy, our sulfurs are really big. Or, you know, they're not hatching during the normal period of time. And for those of you, I'll just point out some things you're already probably seeing. And that is, you know, sulfurs or pale evening duns have 3 tails. This specimen only has 2. The sulfurs or pale evening duns have a blue dun wing, not a yellow wing with some markings. And again, the body is almost amber. And so if you're saying no, that's not really a species, again, you can leave early. It's actually a light Cahill. But again, people are confused. When these are hatching along with sulfurs, you'll see them. Their sailboats are much larger, excuse me, than that of the pale evening duns or the sulfurs. So that's one species that we as fly fishers call a light Cahill. There are 5 others, believe it or not, that we refer to in the literature as light Cahills. So what are sulfurs, or what are the pale evening duns? Here's 2 of them. Here's another that the gentleman that reworked this group, his mother's name was Penelope and his father's name was Maximilian. There's the reason for the change in the genus. Again, that's what some people call the big sulfur. And then Dorothea's, that's what out of the Cumberland Valley and Vince Marinaro and Charlie Fox suggested. But there's several species that are referred to as sulfurs. I would like to suggest, as I saw some of you nodding your heads, that these be referred to as pale evening duns, and we would imitate them on size 14s. And the species Septentrionalis is actually a species you'll see in association with moss-covered substrate, and usually in first order and second order streams, but it is a legit size 12. And then sulfur, I wished we would use to suggest the size 18 that emerges a little bit later, starting in mid to late June through the end of July. Let's look at a few. Here's what some people call the light sulfur, and we actually have light sulfur nymphs in the fly shop boxes as well as dark sulfur nymphs. But again, look what I think is a sign of a good meal. Look at those black wing pads. And I think, you can tell that that's a male. You can actually see the red eyes through the nymphal exoskeleton. Here's the same species, but it's a different color phase, if you will. And my discussions with Pat McCafferty, who is an excellent mayfly specialist who's retired from Purdue, he strongly believes that in elevated consumption of nitrogen, that will darken the pigments of aquatic insects. There's George Harvey's sulfur nymph, just pheasant tail for the tails, dubbing for the body, and you can just barely see it. George was an advocate of gold wire to imitate ribbing, and for durability, he actually used brown polypropylene for the wing case. Here's another darker color phase, imitation wood duck or wood duck for the tail, a dark chocolate hairline dubbing, partridge for the legs, dark wings, could be thin skin, could be mallard, and the use of brown or black thread. This is an illustration out of Great Rivers, Great Hatches, book that Randy mentioned I co-authored in the early 90s with Charlie Meck. It just shows you the different stages that we could imitate, including the one at 4 that I believe the trailing shuck of Antron on a sparkle dun or on a comparadun imitates that transitional period quite nicely. And again, I'll just say, look at those eyes, not just the blue-winged olives. Look at those red eyes on the male pale evening dun or sulfur. Whether you like cut wings, yeah, they twist tippet material, but they sometimes on tough fish are effective. That's not a steelhead. I got lucky one day on sulfurs and caught, I guess we call that a rainbow with shoulders. I don't recall how long it was, but it was a big fish. Sometimes our swarms of pale evening duns, hopefully you've gotten to be downstream of an event such as I've captured here. And again, those are all females with those egg sacs at the ends of their body at dusk, about ready to drop to the water to let loose that egg cluster. And then you want to be downstream of what looks like fog above a riffle to fish 2 pale evening dun spinner falls. Again, they maintain those big compound eyes as males and that red color. Note the difference, how dark the sulfur or pale evening dun male spinner's body is. I mentioned to you the large sulfur. This might be misidentified as a Hendrickson or a red quill, but this is actually the big or large sulfur. It almost looks, when I see it, like a spider mated with a mayfly. It's in the same family as pale evening duns, but it is a larger specimen. Doesn't it look like, where's the spider it mated with? Look at how long the legs are. Again, you'll see these in first and second order streams. Fairly common, and again, fish feed on them. And that's the male spinner. And here's the female. And again, look at the elongate legs, even in the female. And here's another question. I took this photo. I did not see after I got, this will tell you how long I've had it, after I shot film in Kodachrome 64. Hopefully, as you look at this specimen, you see all good insects have 3 pairs of legs. The front pair are just abbreviated. And I think this specimen as a nymph may have had a close encounter with a sculpin or some other forage fish, or maybe even a small trout. But what is unusual, I think you see that the compound eye on this specimen is very small. So it's not a male, yet when you go back to the tip of the abdomen, beneath the tails, you can see it's got claspers or forceps. So again, not everything goes according to the genetic plan in the insect world. This was a specimen. Again, I did work and was out sampling the day the accident happened at 3 Mile Island, but this was not a specimen collected near that plant. Again, things don't always go according to Mother Nature's genetic or DNA sequence. Here's what I hope we would eventually apply in our trade and newsletters in the fly fishing world, that this species, the Dorotheas, we call the true sulfur. They're imitated by a size 18 spinner in this case. Again, even it has those bright red eyes. One that I think you may encounter, but I debated putting this in, and it has to do with people will come up to me and say, Greg, you know, you talked about and did work on the green drake. The green drakes that I've seen pictures of, their words, don't look at all like the ones we have on our stream during the 3rd week in May. And so this is an image I took the day that George Harvey and Charlie Meck and I went to fish this particular large mayfly. It used to be in the genus Hexagenia, but it's got some morphological differences. Just to give you a size comparison, that's a mountain laurel leaf that it's resting on. Legit size 8 mayfly. This is the largest mayfly in North America. It used to be Hexagenia recurvata. The reason for the change, lito means single, and then branca means branch. When you look at the nymph, it only has 1 gill, whereas all the other hexes have 2 gills on the first abdominal segment. This is a huge burrowing mayfly. It loves cold, bog-fed streams. Now, probably in Massachusetts, I'm guessing you might see this the end of May. But again, cold, bog-fed streams, the substrate it prefers is sort of a something that you would walk on, and it would underfoot be like wet concrete. It's looks sandy and it's firm. It's not silt, and that's where these nymphs will develop. And again, a large mayfly. When you see these spinners on the water, they mimic the large stoneflies that we see early in the year. But again, keep your eyes peeled the latter part of May. It's not the eastern green drake, it's the dark green drake. Many years ago, an American angler, Charlie Meck, and I wrote an article on this species. There's another drake, the western green drake, but again, that's in the same family as Hendrickson's red quills, blue-winged olives, and pale evening duns. So it's not even a burrowing mayfly. Sorry, it's a personal thing. This is the most beautiful insect on planet Earth, the eastern green drake. Wide distribution in the east and the southeast part of the country. Again, look at those dark wing pads. I think that's a sign of a good meal. Again, when the black locusts are past bloom, great time to be on the water to fish the eastern green drake. This is the green drake on Penns Creek. Note a few dark blotches, and there is a specimen I collected from Cedar Run in north central Pennsylvania. Not as productive a stream, and as a result, these are at least a size, maybe two, smaller than those on Penns Creek, on Fishing Creek, and some of the productive streams. And then that abundance of black blotching, again, this is where I had discussions with Pat McCafferty. He believes that's the result of consumption of elevated amounts of nitrogen in their diet. Here's something that may have application. When I was working on Great Rivers, Great Hatches, Mike Calvin on the left was a student at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. Tim Rudovitz was on the right, and we went back into the South Branch of the Au Sable in Michigan. And I was in a van, and they came and followed in a van, and they broke out this sign. And I said, you know, why didn't you guys tell me? They were working at Rusty Gates Fly Shop in Grayling, or near Grayling, Michigan. And I said, why didn't you tell me there was a school, and you know, I would have went elsewhere. They said, Greg, we put that sign up, and you notice it's facing oncoming traffic. When they come here and they see our van, they see your van, they'll think there's a school here. They'll turn around and leave, and we'll have the place to ourselves. So again, on your heavy fished water, maybe you can develop your own sign to reduce pressure. That was during the hex hatch on the water. Here's Penns Creek, the confluence of Poe-Patty, at Poe-Patty and Poe Creek. This is why I don't like the green drake. You do need elbow pads. It's just an opportunity to catch a large fish on a dry fly. And you can see, I think that bend is very well covered. But again, it's an opportunity. You sometimes have to stay a little later, but you can catch some really nice fish on these large mayflies. There are also a group of anglers that still hit Penns Creek, and you'll see them with the grasshopper cages collecting the duns and putting them in the cage, and then they'll fish on a size 10 or a size 12 bait hook. They'll put one or two or three of the duns, they'll fish fly fishing tackle, and they'll splat them on the water. And they call it fishing the bouquet. And all I can tell you is it's a deadly technique in catching large fish during the green drake hatch. But again, I titled this slide, it's a choice, and that happens to be the cut wing I use during this time. Last example, folks. What do you call this species? And again, I'm now traveling into limestone influenced water or spring fed water. And if you said, well, I think that's either a scud or a freshwater shrimp, absolutely correct. It's not an insect because it's got more than 3 pairs of legs. It's got 2 pairs of antennae, and again, lives for an extended period of time in limestone or limestone influenced trout streams. Got to ask you, it's the teacher in me. Describe what you see in this illustration. Please, GP rated. It's not what you think it is. It's a behavior that scuds and freshwater shrimp will use, and the male is the larger of the two specimens in this illustration, and they will latch on to a female, and they'll do this mate guarding for 8 to 10 hours to ensure their genes get passed on and maintain the quality of that particular insect relative. I've kicked these individuals and then, into a D-frame net, and then turned the net inside out, plopped them in a white plastic tub, and they're still mate guarding after I've abused them, kicking them off the bottom, turning the net inside out. So again, pretty intense behavior. I will be frank with you. I've never seen a fly tires imitation of this particular event. Maybe a challenge to those of you that are tires. I've seen this. I've seen it on YouTube. I've overheard conversations in fly shops, and I just when I think I heard something unique, I hear something different. Describe what you see here, and I've heard lots of different descriptions. This orange area, I've heard it referred to. It's a pregnant female. Well, that's a large specimen. That's probably a male. So I doubt that that could be, eggs, or it could be a respiratory organ. Definitely not the case. But think of how many flies we tie these days with hot spots, whether they imitate the eyes, whether they imitate this particular event or this particular situation. What you're looking at, folks, is a cyst, or it could be several of them, of an intermediate stage of a parasite called either thorny-headed or spiny-headed worms in a scientific designation called acanthocephalans. Now, you're saying, okay, Hoover, where are you going with this one? What I want to tell you is these individuals, when they're infected, changes their behavior. And I'm sure you're not surprised. And normally where you would see scuds and freshwater shrimp would be in amongst the vegetation in those limestone influenced or limestone water. What happens when this intermediate stage of a thorny-headed worm gets inside, it modifies their behavior, and they now swim out into the open water. And therefore, they're more vulnerable. They're obviously observed by fish, whether they be our quarry trout or other fishes that feed on macroinvertebrates. There was some research conducted, and I think there's at least 5 refereed journals in Great Britain, one of which evaluated whether or not trout showed an interest in this, and they absolutely did. There was a preference for them feeding on this orange cyst-infested specimen. And you're saying, well, so what? Well, again, advantage spiny-headed worm. They now finish their development in the guts of fishes. And so that vulnerable swimming into the open water because of being infested with the intermediate stage allows the worm to complete its development. And about 18%, if I hadn't said it, of the scuds are infested with this cyst from thorny-headed or spiny-headed worm. And so you, I'm sure, have seen scud imitations. Some people like dubbed hot spots. Others put a bead in the center of their scuds to imitate that particular trigger, I'm sure, that gets the attention of trout. So to wrap things up, to use a gentleman who hails from New Jersey or from New Hampshire. Spent some time with him back in 2012. He was a speaker for the Penn State Fly Fishing Club. This is a quote from Thomas Ames. For those of you that have his book, Eastern Caddisflies, phenomenal work. But again, Tom will also say, well, I'm a photographer too, Hoover. But his quote was, if you're going to use a description, make sure you get it right, whether it's in articles or whether it's newsletters or communicating amongst fellow fly rod anglers. And with that, this is a shot of my middle son when we were very fortunate to hit a brown drake spinner fall on Pine Creek several years ago. And it was a memorable evening because I hooked and lost the biggest brown trout I've ever had on a dry fly. And so with that, I wish all of you best of the hatches. And if there are any questions, I'd be glad to address them now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Excellent presentation.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry I forgot about this one, but when I mentioned about different species, this isn't part of the talk, but I should back up. But again, look at that. Where Light Cahill as a pattern gets us in big time trouble. But again, you all know it's an excellent fly pattern in size 10s to size 18s. So I'm not, choosing to badmouth the Light Cahill. It's an excellent fly, but look at the different species that it suggests. So anyway, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Greg?
I've got a comment, Eric.
Sure. Kevin, go ahead.
I thank you for the presentation, and you brought me back to a great memory of quite a few years ago. I was on the Hoosick River, and this is before the guides beat the crap out of it, and we actually had a chance to pick up a few fish in an evening. And there was this one pool where there were 3 fish that were coming up, and I thought for sure they were sulfurs, and I was less experienced at the time, and I threw everything but the kitchen sink at those fish, and I couldn't. They wouldn't come to the fly at all. They had no interest in it whatsoever. So I called a fellow member, Mike Rinaldi, who is an amazing angler and also a fly tyer, lived in Adams and spent a lot of time in the upper Deerfield, and he passed away a few years ago. And so I called him up from my cell phone, explained my plight, and he says, well, no, they're not sulfurs, right? It's the gray wing yellow quill, the Porus vitreus.
Mm-hmm.
And so he says, I'll send you some.
Mm-hmm.
And so a couple days later, I got the box, and here it is, if you can see it. And in it was about at least a dozen flies, and I think that I still have 10 of them.
Beautiful.
And I went back and within it is a great little note from Mike. And I just share this because this is the kind of guy that Mike was, and he was a great member, and he was just a great person. And he says, "Hi, Kev, the fly that's on the Hoosick River is now what's called the Porus species is vitreus. It's not a true sulfur. It's called the gray wing yellow quill. Last week in May to first week in June. I'll give you a few different varieties of this fly. The bodies will vary a little. The egg-bearing female dun has a pink underbelly.
Yep.
The males are the yellowish brown olive color."
Yep.
And so I went back to that pool, and sure enough, the 2 fish were next to each other, and they were rising like crazy. And I put the female version on very good drifts, no interest whatsoever. Tried the second one, no interest whatsoever. And then put the males on. First float through, hooked one, next float through, hooked the other one, turned around, hooked another fish. And it was just, I mean, when you start talking about colors of eyes and colors of bodies, and particularly with a river that's fished so much like that, how much of a difference it can make. But then I've also experienced occasions over there where it was a true sulfur hatch, and there was some fish that were being rather particular. And then I saw the sulfur, and I saw, look at that, the green eyes. And I'm assuming a sulfur can have green eyes, right? Not the red eyes.
It's funny you bring that up, and I think it was in Mike Cole's book. He may have some photographs. And what happens? Proteins in the compound eyes of mayflies will break down, and it will cause color changes to go from a chalky white to that green color, Kevin.
Yeah, and so what I did is I came back, because they're so damn particular over there. So I came back and I tied up some. I like fishing usuals with just I'll either use a dub body but I use snowshoe for the wing, and or I'll use typically I'll use a goose biot, and but then I tied it off, and then I took a couple of turns of green on the front, and sure enough, that night they were just all over it, and that just little bit of green, it just made the difference.
You'll find this interesting. I didn't include it. I was a banquet speaker in North Carolina and in Rhode Island, and I proposed just briefly, because this kind of talk is not banquet fodder. There are other folks there that could care less about insects, but I made mention of the red eyes, and that I think it might be a sign of a good meal. I cannot use the language that I was subject to by two rather irate individuals, both in North Carolina and Rhode Island, basically saying they'd been doing it for years. Why did you share that with everybody? So again, sometimes you can throw, a dead cat and they'll eat it. And other times, and I think something else that George Harvey instilled in me, and that was keeping your tippet long so that you get as drag-free a presentation of your dry flies as possible. And he was not bashful about putting 30 to 36 inches of 4X, 5X, 6X tippet to get as drag-free a presentation on difficult fish.
Thank you for your presentation. It was great.
Well, thank you for your comments, Kevin.
Greg, I've been fishing Penns Creek for about 15 years now, the Penns Creek area. And one time I went over with a friend and we fished Fishing Creek, and I tried sulfur after sulfur after sulfur, and that's what the fish were rising for, but they would let my pattern go by and they'd take like 3 others. I got back to Hemlock Acres and said to my friend, I tried all these patterns. He said, oh, the reason is they were dark wing sulfurs. And I was like, why didn't you tell me that before?
Yeah. It's you would think 2 watersheds that close together that the insect fauna has got to be so similar that it's not worthwhile worrying about it. But I will tell you, Penns Creek does not have the dark green drake, but Fishing Creek boasts a fishable dark green drake emergence during the latter part of May. And sometimes you will fish both dark green drakes and the eastern green drakes the same time. Fishing Creek is not an easy stream to fish because it's so productive, and thermally, it's usually a week to 10 days behind those hatches that occur on Penns Creek. So it's, yeah, you've run into one of many scenarios that Fishing Creek can be really, really tough. And yet there are some huge brown trout that survive all that pressure. And I will imagine that you were in the narrows upstream of the federal hatchery, and that's where Joe Humphreys caught his 16-pound brown trout back in the 70s, night fishing, and that was up in the big pool that's next to the state hatchery at the top of the narrows. But he worked for that fish for several years before he ended up hooking it. And that was something that George Harvey and his friend were there, and they saw two fish come up during late afternoon and reveal themselves in that pool. And I forget, I think George was in the water and his buddy was on the bank. And he said, George, cut off whatever you've got and put the biggest damn fly you have on, because there are two huge fish just upstream of you. And this was like June, mid to late June. And so George did, and he said, all I did was put the fish down. But according to George, before he passed, he said to me, I don't think Joe got the big one. So imagine that in terms of, the size of the fish that are able to, go undetected and unscathed with all the angling pressure that Fishing Creek receives. So. Any other questions? If you don't have any now and something comes up, Randy, hopefully I don't put you on the spot, but I've been accused of answering emails. And again, I would not wish that this is the only time or the last time we interact. If you have any questions about mayflies, as I said, I did the 4-year research project on mayflies of Pennsylvania. We've got a very rich state, but if you have any questions as it relates to fishing, I did manage to get out for an hour this afternoon, and we've got, as I said, early black stoneflies fluttering around and on a body of water that flows through my property, my wife's property as well. It's a Class A wild brown and brook trout stream. I managed to coax about a 9-inch male brook trout to the surface with 4X tippet and a size 14 early black stonefly, dry fly. So the water temperature is 41 degrees. Anyway, the best is yet to come. And again, I appreciate Deerfield River TU having me as a speaker, and look forward to interacting with you if you have any follow-ups. And thanks to Randy for twisting my arm. That wasn't too difficult, but my pleasure speaking to the group.
Thank you so much, Greg. It was really great presentation and beautiful photos, and great to kind of hear stories about Penn State.
Yeah, we're wrestling this weekend, and I will tell you, in the fly fishing courses, there were hockey players, there were wrestlers, had a couple football players, but it is amazing to me how students at Penn State got turned on as it relates to whether it's the art of fly tying. We did do and had 3 field trips to Fisherman's Paradise as part of the course. And I still get emails and write letters of reference for some of the students I had. And in fact, this summer, I'm getting together with a group of students that were in the club. And my oldest son said, "Geez, Dad, you must have had rapport with the students." He said, "I don't remember most of my professors to get invited back to go fly fishing with former students." I said, "Hey, I love them like they were my own." So
Oh, that's
anyway,
great. That's
yep.
great.
Yep.
Well, you're certainly welcome to come out here, and we'll take you out on the river sometime if you ever in the neighborhood. We'd love to have you out here, and you can tell us some of the fine points of about the number of gills on the first.
No,
Yeah,
I just had an opportunity to bore you with that tonight. I'll
that
tell
was
you
good.
one memory in the early 90s. We were up near one of the dams that provides whitewater experience, and I was fishing with Mark Aroner, the
Oh,
bamboo
sure.
fly
Yeah,
rod
Mark's a good
builder.
friend of mine.
Yeah, and Mark said, "Greg, when you hear those people start screaming, get the hell out of the water, because if you don't, you're going to get wiped downstream." And I'll tell you, I was in the middle. There's some beautiful
Oh, really?
paper birches right out there, right in the shore where I was, and I had to really hustle to beat the wall of water back to the shore. He was spot on that if he
Yeah.
would have alerted me, I would have, one more cast may have been my last cast. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Just imagine if you're hooked onto a big fish when that happens.
oh, just pray for backing. Anyway,
Thanks so much
Yep.
for doing this. It was really great.
Thanks.
We really
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it.
me.
And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Greg.
Randy.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Greg. Hey,
You're
Greg, I'll
welcome,
give you a
Randy.
call. We'll catch up.
Okay, sounds good. Good
Do
night.
well.
Yep.
Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Brian, I'll motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
Thanks. All right. All in favor? Say
Aye.
goodbye.
Bye.
Night all.
Good night.
See you guys.
Good night.
Good night.